Welcome to Nero Secrets. I am Jimmy, your host for today's mystery. We're joining Nero Wolfe and the scent that solved the case. Chapter 1. The Client Who Smelled Trouble. If you ever find yourself waking up in a midtown Manhattan brownstone with the thought, today might actually be a quiet one, do yourself a favor. Go back to bed. I made that mistake at precisely 9:30 on a brisk Tuesday in late October, and by 10 we had a woman in the office who smelled like trouble and perfume. In that order, the buzzer rang while I was halfway through polishing the coffee service and trying to convince Fritz that yes, I could tell the difference between Ethiopian and Colombian beans. Fritz gave me a long-suffering look as he wiped his hands on a kitchen towel and went to answer it. A moment later, he returned with that polite little wince of his that always means either the milk has gone sour or the guest might. "A Miss Phoebe Delancey to see Mr. Wolfe," he said. "She says it's urgent." That word, urgent, doesn't usually get much traction in this house, unless it's followed by orchid rot or missing bottle of beer. Wolfe at the time was exactly where you'd expect him to be, parked in the office chair that could survive a small explosion, glaring at a leather-bound volume of Pliny the Elder like it had personally offended him. I told her, "Mr. Wolfe does not entertain walk-ins," Fritz added, looking hopeful. "Tell her she'll be thrilled to know that," I said, already moving. "Wolfe hasn't spoken to a live woman before lunch in a week. Might do him good." Wolfe grunted. "Archie, if you intend to bring that interloper in here without an appointment, I shall be forced to endure 10 minutes of mild discomfort and possibly earn a fee." I finished. "It's the depression again, sir. People are desperate. We should at least be polite." That earned me a withering glare. Wolfe hated being reminded that people might expect him to work for a living. I opened the door, and there she was. Phoebe Delancey. Mid-30s, sleek red hair pinned back like it belonged on a Vogue cover, a cream-coloured coat buttoned to the throat, and an expression that suggested she'd had to bite her tongue just to get this far. But what hit me first wasn't the coat, the cheekbones, or the shoes that cost more than my suit. It was the scent. Not just perfume, though that was there. Something floral but faint, like crushed lilac in the spring. No, underneath it, there was something else, something off. A note that didn't belong. "Miss Delancey," I said. "Archie Goodwin. You've already met our resident gatekeeper. Come on in." She nodded once and glided in like she was being pulled by an invisible string. "Mr. Goodwin, thank you." We entered the office, and Wolfe didn't rise. Of course not. He did, however, peer at her over the rim of his gold-rimmed glasses like he was examining an unfamiliar fungus. "Sit," he said. "Speak." She blinked. I'd seen people flinch at Wolfe's delivery before, but she took it well. She seated herself across from him and crossed her legs with practiced elegance. "Need help?" she said. "My fiancé is dead. The police say it was an accident. I know it wasn't." That got Wolfe's attention. His eyebrow ticked upward like a flag being raised. I slid into my chair and picked up my notepad. Name of the deceased? Julian. Richter. He was an industrial chemist. We were planning to marry next spring. Her voice was steady, clipped. He was found in his lab 3 nights ago. The gas main had ruptured. The authorities concluded it was a tragic equipment failure, but Julian was meticulous. And he didn't make mistakes. Wolfe let out a sigh, the kind that usually precedes a refusal. I beat him to it. What made you think it wasn't an accident? I asked. She looked at me directly, because he called me the night before and said he'd found something alarming, something that might change everything. He didn't explain, just told me not to speak to anyone. Then he was dead. Wolfe said nothing. He rarely did when a client was digging her own emotional grave. Phoebe reached into her handbag, a tiny thing that matched her coat, and pulled out a small envelope. This was in his jacket. It's a fragment from one of his notebooks. I took it. Just a torn piece of lined paper with a hastily scribbled note. The third compound reacts oddly with heat. Smells like almonds? Not right. Must compare with test from Tuesday. Danger. I passed it to Wolfe. He didn't move, so I read it aloud. Cyanide? I asked. That was my first thought too, she said quietly. Wolfe finally spoke. Miss Delancey, this is circumstantial at best. A tragic coincidence does not make for a crime. She reached into her coat again. This time she produced a small sealed vial. This was in his apartment, taped beneath a drawer in his writing desk. I found it yesterday. Fritz entered quietly to announce that the eggs were nearly ready, but Wolfe waved him off with surprising irritation. I took the vial. Inside was a clear fluid, just a few milliliters. No label, no scent, just mystery in a glass coat. You're not exactly playing it safe, hiding this, I told her. I didn't know what else to do. I can't go to the police. They've closed the case. But I know this wasn't an accident. Wolfe closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, I could tell he was already turning the problem over in that overfed brain of his like a chess player memorizing the board. What was he working on? He asked. A new line of industrial adhesives. But he was also consulting for a cosmetics firm. Ah, Wolfe murmured. Perfume and poison, a classic combination. I looked at him. You'll take the case? I will consider it, he said, after lunch. Phoebe's lips tightened. I'll wait. I raised a brow. That's not a suggestion, Miss Delancey. Around here, lunch is sacred. She glanced at Wolfe, who hadn't moved, then at me. Fine, I'll return at 2. She stood, her coat catching the light just so. But please, if you don't help me, no one else will. After she left, Wolfe sniffed the air, then leaned back. Archie, he said, what do you smell? Lilacs, I said, and a hint of panic. He grunted. And something else, something that doesn't belong. I looked at the vial in my hand and nodded. Yeah, like the kind of scent you only smell once, right before everything goes sideways. Wolfe tapped his fingers on the armrest. We begin after lunch. And that was how the case started. With a dead chemist, a worried fiancé, and a scent that didn't make sense. Not yet. Chapter 2. The Lab with No Footprints. By the time Miss Delancey returned at 2 o'clock sharp, wearing the same cream coat and the same air of composed desperation, I had already made a few calls, scribbled a few notes, and brewed a second pot of coffee that Wolfe wouldn't touch unless it came with a tray, a linen napkin, and Fritz's approval. She took the red chair again, spine straight, hands folded in her lap like she was bracing for a second interview. Wolfe, of course, hadn't moved an inch since lunch except to digest. His daily routine was as rigid as his temper, and breaking it was an event worth documenting in the Times. He studied her for a moment before finally speaking. "Miss Delancey, I've decided to engage. Mr. Goodwin will undertake the initial inquiry. You will, in return, be candid, cooperative, and punctual." "I understand," she said quickly. "No, you don't, but you will." He turned his gaze toward me. "Archie, you will begin with Mr. Richter's laboratory and residence. Learn what you can without advertising our involvement." "Sure," I said, sliding my notebook into my coat pocket, a subtle charm offensive, one eyebrow raised at a time. Miss Delancey stood as I did. "I can take you to both places. I have keys." That saved me a conversation with the super and a potential run-in with the NYPD. I grabbed my coat and followed her down the front steps of the brownstone, out into a city where the air smelled like wet newsprint and steam grates. Her car was a sleek grey Chrysler coupe, parked halfway down the block. She drove like someone who had memorized the timing of every light on Park Avenue and didn't care who knew it. We headed downtown to the lab first, a 2-floor rental tucked inside a bland commercial building near East Houston. The outside was forgettable. The inside wasn't. Clean, clinical, and quiet, with steel counters, racks of equipment, and a faint lingering smell of antiseptic and solvents. There were no overturned chairs, no scattered papers, just order. Too much of it, in fact. "This is where they found him?" I asked, moving toward the long steel table in the center. "Yes," she said. "He was lying here, next to the Bunsen rig. They said the gas line had a fault, and he passed out before he could react." I crouched down beside the rig. The linoleum near it had been scrubbed recently. Too recently. "Who cleaned the place?" I asked. "His business partner, a man named Harold Cale. He said he couldn't bear to leave the lab like that. Julian's family signed off on it." "Convenient," I muttered. "Does Cale have any reason to wish Julian dead?" She hesitated. They had their disagreements. Harold thought Julian was wasting time on side projects instead of focusing on production contracts. I straightened and looked around. The lab was sterile, yes, but maybe a little too sterile. I'd seen crime scenes wiped down before, but this one didn't smell like bleach. It smelled floral. I moved slowly toward a small air vent near the corner of the room and took a cautious sniff. There it was again, faint but present. The same odd perfume from her coat. Was Julian in the habit of wearing scent? I asked. Of course not. I crouched again. A small air freshener sat tucked behind the vent grating. Not a standard brand either. Handmade. A linen pouch with dried petals and herbs. Lilac and something bitter underneath. What is it? She asked. Something someone didn't want noticed, I said. Either to cover up another scent or replace it. Her face paled. But why? I didn't answer. Not yet. I took out my pocket camera and snapped a few shots of the rig, the table, and the vent before we headed to Julian's apartment on West 73rd. It was a decent place. Tidy, classic pre-war, high ceilings, modest but tasteful furniture, and the faintest trace of that same floral smell near the writing desk. She showed me the drawer where she'd found the vial, taped underneath, she said. I almost didn't see it. Did he live alone? Yes. No pets, no visitors apart from me and Harold. Maybe his sister once in a while. I opened the drawer. Nothing unusual now. I checked the underside and found faint residue from the A tape. She wasn't lying. Then I spotted it. A matchbook wedged behind a stack of invoices. It was from a bar in the East Village. The Cloven Hoof. Nice name. Not Julian's usual scene, judging by the apartment. Have you ever gone drinking? With him here, she shook her head. Julian didn't drink, not socially. I pocketed it. Maybe Harold does. We stood in the apartment for another 10 minutes, her answering my questions with poise that barely hid the strain. I noticed a picture of Julian on the mantel. Sharp-featured, clean-cut, glasses. A man with the look of someone who'd lived most of his life inside his own head. Not the type to stumble over a gas line. When I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe had his nose in a book of Hungarian cuisine and a scowl on his face that deepened the moment he saw me. Well, Julian's lab was clean enough to eat off, but not clean enough to explain the weird sachet in the vent that smells like our client's perfume. His apartment checks out. Nothing staged. But I did find a matchbook from a place called the Cloven Hoof, which smells like a good spot to ask questions and get punched. Wolfe exhaled slowly. Archie, kindly discover who owns that establishment, and whether this Harold Cale is a creature of habit or merely opportunity. On it. He closed his book with a thud. And Archie, bring me that sachet. I wish to smell it myself. Of course you do, I muttered. Heaven forbid your nose be denied the evidence. And just like that, the hunt was on. Chapter 3. The Man Who Didn't Drink. By the time I got to the Cloven Hoof, dusk had muscled its way across the city skyline, and the bar had just cracked open for business. It was one of those places that clung to irony like a bad aftershave. Black leather booths, red neon lighting, and a jukebox that hadn't been updated since jazz forgot how to swing. The bartender was a square-jawed, bleary-eyed guy in a sleeveless Ramones tee, who looked like he'd been poured into it back in '83 and never changed. He was polishing a glass that didn't need polishing, which in my experience meant he didn't want to make conversation. Naturally, I gave him some anyway. Will Julian Richter ever come in here? I asked, flashing the matchbook and my best forgettable smile. The bartender squinted at it. Don't know the name. We get a lot of ghosts in here. Smart ones. The kind who drinks seltzer and asks questions. He gave me a once-over. You a cop? Nope. Just a friendly neighborhood nuisance with an expense account. He rolled his eyes. I saw the guy. Clean cut, wore a grey coat, glasses, came in maybe 4, 5 times over the past couple weeks. Sat in the back corner, nursed a club soda, and watched people. Alone? The bartender shook his head. Sometimes. Other times he had a guy with him. Balding, nervous, looked like a guy who uses coasters at dive bars. That narrowed it down. Could it be Harold Cale? Could be. I don't ask names. I pour and I forget. He turned away like the conversation was over, but I had one more jab. Ever see them argue? A shrug. Not really. But your soda guy? He looked like he was waiting on something. Or someone. I tipped him a $5 and moved to the corner booth. It still smelled like lemon cleaner and regret. I sat there a moment, trying to picture Richter nursing his club soda and sniffing the air for danger. What was a chemist doing in a place like this? Watching someone? Or meeting them? Back outside, the night had turned cold and tight. I called Wolfe from the payphone on the corner. He answered with his usual cheer, which is to say none. "Well?" he asked. "Richter was a regular," I told him. "Didn't drink. Met someone. There a few times. Balding, cautious. Could be Harold Cale." "Could be, is not certain," Wolfe grumbled. "Did you procure a name?" "Bartender doesn't play friendly, but Richter looked like he was waiting for something. Maybe watching. If it was Cale, they weren't exactly toasting each other." Wolfe huffed. "Return at once. We must discuss our next step before dinner," which was Wolfe speak for hurry, before the trout soufflé loses its dignity. Back at the brownstone, I handed over the sachet from the lab and gave Wolfe a full rundown. He sniffed the pouch, closed his eyes, and leaned back. Lilac. And he inhaled again. "Not almonds, no. Bitter almonds are too sharp. This is heliotrope, and something artificial. Synthetic." "Poison?" I asked, not directly, but designed to mask one, perhaps. "So, we've got a dead chemist, a mysterious scent, a suspicious partner, and a bar that doubles as a dead drop," I said, "and a client who somehow smelled like that sachet without setting foot in the lab. She claimed she never visited the laboratory," Wolfe said, fingers steepled, "but she carried the scent with her, which means either she lied or the scent travelled another way." I raised an eyebrow. "Like from Julian's clothes?" "Possibly, or from another source entirely. The question is, what purpose does a misleading scent serve in a scientific workspace? To throw someone off? Or," Wolfe said, his voice softening with thought, "to hide the presence of something else entirely." There was a pause. Then the phone rang. I picked it up. "Goodwin." The voice on the other end was thin and anxious. "This is Harold Cale. I heard you were asking questions." "I'm flattered. What can I do for you?" "I'd prefer to talk in person. I didn't kill Julian, but there's something I need to explain. I didn't go to the police because I was scared. Still am." "Where and when?" "My office. Tomorrow morning, 9 sharp." He hung up before I could get a protest in. Wolfe looked at me with narrowed eyes. "Well, Cale wants to talk." "He will," Wolfe said, "if he survives the night." "Charming," I muttered. "I'll go early." Wolfe rose, slowly, like a mountain preparing to sneeze, and headed for the dining room. "Be careful, Archie. The killer has already shown initiative, and Julian Richter, it seems, was playing a more dangerous game than we thought." "Noted," I said, scribbling the address. "But if I wind up in a lab with the gas turned on, tell Fritz to save me a slice of the soufflé." And with that, the next move was set. One that might take us deeper into the formula behind a murder, or blow the whole thing sky high. Chapter 4. The Partner with the Shaking Hands. Harold Cale's office was in a squat grey building on the east side, wedged between a shuttered deli and a travel agency that still advertised fares to Havana. The directory in the foyer said, "Cale Richter Industrial Solutions, Suite 201. The peeling lettering didn't inspire confidence. Neither did the waiting area. 2 chairs, 1 plant, and a stack of technical magazines so old they still called plastics the future. I was there 5 minutes before 9. The door to Suite 201 was locked. I waited, leaning against the wall and keeping an ear out for footsteps or sudden explosions. At 9:04, I heard keys jangling. The door opened and Harold Cale poked, his head out like a mole checking for predators. He looked exactly as advertised, balding, twitchy, with a narrow face that seemed designed for apologizing. He wore a sweater vest over a wrinkled shirt and had the vague air of a man who'd once been yelled at in chemistry class and never quite recovered. "Mr. Goodwin?" he asked, squinting. "That's me," I said, stepping forward. "You must be Cale." Yes, come in, quickly." Inside, the office was cramped and overly warm, filled with filing cabinets, glass flasks, and the unmistakable tang of old coffee and chemical solvents. The windows were shut tight. He closed the door behind me and pulled the blinds with one shaky hand. "Paranoid much?" I asked. He didn't smile. "I have reason to be. Julian's death wasn't an accident. You'll have to do better than that," I said, settling into a creaky chair. Cale sat across from me and rubbed his hands together like he was trying to start a fire. "He'd been working on something secret," he said. "Told me it was a side project, nothing to do with the adhesives, but he wouldn't tell me more, just said it was dangerous." What kind of danger? The kind that makes you sleep with the lights on. That sounded dramatic. I let him run. I found a locked cabinet in the lab a few days before he died. When I asked him about it, he said to stay out. Said it was better I didn't know. "Chish. You listen? Of course not." I picked the lock. Inside was a set of notes, chemical formulas, scent compounds, tests with varying heat reactions. There was one labelled Synthesis A3, untraceable compound. It was a combination of perfume base and a fast-dissipating alkaloid. The formula referenced cyanogenic glycosides. That's cyanide precursors," I said. "I know," he swallowed. "Exactly. It wouldn't show up in a standard tox screen unless you were looking for it. Julian had designed a scent that could mask the release of something deadly." I confronted him. He said it was theoretical, but he was scared, and that scared me. "And then he ended up dead in his lab." He nodded. "That's why I cleaned it. I panicked. I didn't want to be implicated, but I didn't kill him." "That lab was sterile," I said. "But you missed a sachet in the air vent. Wolfe thinks it was used to mask another smell." Cale blinked. That must have been his prototype. Of the scent or the poison? He didn't answer. Did he have enemies? Cale hesitated. He consulted for a cosmetics firm, Delacroix and Moore. Boutique, but growing. He told me he was unhappy with them. Said they pressured him to speed up his research, even hinted at pushing boundaries. Who was the contact there? A woman named Portia Moore. Stylish, sharp, the kind who gets what she wants and doesn't care how. Julian's fiancée, Phoebe Delancey, ever met her? I think so. At a party Julian threw for investors. I remember the air in that room. It was thick, like walking into a perfume cloud. That made sense. Wolfe had said heliotrope. I was starting to think the scent was the thread pulling this whole thing together. Cale rubbed his temples. "Please, Mr. Goodwin." I didn't hurt him, but someone wanted that formula badly enough to scare him, and maybe kill him for it. I stood. "You've been helpful, Mr. Cale. Don't leave town. And if anyone else comes asking questions, Call us first." He nodded, and I stepped out into the hallway, letting the door close behind me with a soft click. My gut told me Cale was scared, not lying. If he was acting, it was an award-worthy performance, and I've seen my share of hams. I called Wolfe from the drugstore on the corner. He was working on a weaponized scent, I told him, the kind that kills softly and leaves no trace. Wolfe was silent for a moment. Then, "Where did you say he consulted?" "Delacroix and Moore." Portia Moore. Yes, I recall reading about her. A formidable woman. Archie requests an appointment. Be direct, and take precautions. Precautions? You're not a flower, but I prefer my assistants to be conscious. That was as close to be careful as Wolfe ever got. I hung up and made the call. Portia Moore's secretary answered with enough ice in her voice to freeze a pond, but she offered me a slot that afternoon. No name-dropping needed. Maybe she was curious, or maybe she already knew why I was calling. Either way, it smelled like progress. Chapter 5. The Perfume Queen of Park Avenue. If you ever want to feel underdressed and over-questioned, step into the penthouse suite of Delacroix and Moore without a necktie. The reception area alone looked like it cost more than Wolfe's orchid room. Brushed gold finishes, velvet chairs, and a scent in the air so delicate you questioned whether it was perfume or suggestion. The receptionist, a platinum blonde with a nose sharp enough to slice bread, gave me the once-over and announced my arrival with the faintest sniff of contempt. A minute later, the door to the inner office opened, and Portia Moore stepped out like she'd been summoned by a spotlight. She was tall, late 40s, and moved like a metronome set to slow jazz. Her navy blue dress was a masterclass in understated wealth. Her earrings probably worth more than my car. And her perfume, whatever it was, had enough presence to make a statement without shouting. Lilac, again, with something colder beneath. "It, Mr. Goodwin," she said, her voice low and precise. "You're with Mr. Wolfe." "That's right," I said. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." She motioned toward her office. Curiosity is a powerful motivator. Her office was as elegant as the woman herself. Sleek furniture, wall-to-wall windows looking down over the city like it owed her rent. A glass decanter sat untouched on a sideboard, flanked by a stack of product samples labelled in cursive. "Assume this isn't a social call," she said, seating herself behind the desk with a steeple of fingers that mirrored Wolfe's own favourite pose. "You're investigating Julian Richter's death?" I sat down across from her. "You move fast, Miss Moore." She smiled. "This business requires an ear to the ground and friends in the press. Then you also know it was ruled an accident." "Do, but that doesn't mean I believe it. Julian was cautious to a fault. If a Bunsen burner looked at him wrong, he replaced the entire bench." I nodded. "He consulted for your company." "More than that. He was designing a new olfactory base for our next high-end fragrance. A scent with staying power and character. He had a nose for subtleties." "Subtleties like hiding a chemical reaction inside a perfume?" Her expression didn't shift. "You mean the rumour he was dabbling in toxic compounds? That's a smear. We run a cosmetics house, not a poison lab. And yet he was working with heliotrope and bitter additives, not the usual perfume aisle fare." Now she tilted her head slightly. "I never asked what he used. only what effect he could produce. That's how artists work, Mr. Goodwin. They don't explain every stroke of the brush. Maybe not, I said, but artists usually don't wind up dead in their own studios. Her eyes narrowed. Are you accusing me of something? Not yet, I said. Just curious why your perfume matches the scent found in Julian's lab and on his fiancée. There was a beat of silence. Then she exhaled. He gave me a sample. Said it was unstable but intriguing. He thought it might be revolutionary. I wore it once, weeks ago, that's all. Did you ever meet Phoebe Delancey? Briefly. At a fundraiser. She was possessive, cold. I got the impression she didn't care for Julian's professional entanglements. Did Julian say he felt threatened, pressured? By her? Constantly. She wanted him to quit everything. Settle down. Be ordinary. Julian wasn't that kind of man. I watched her for a moment. The woman was smooth, no doubt. But her cool detachment wasn't rehearsed. It was natural. She wasn't hiding nerves. If anything, she was too calm. Did he mention anyone else sniffing around his work? I asked. Competitors, industry rivals. She shrugged. He was protective. But he did say once that someone had tried to bribe his assistant. I don't know who. I didn't ask. That sounded like something Cale had omitted conveniently. Do you have access to Julian's research? I asked. She smiled. Unfortunately for me, and perhaps fortunately for you, Julian kept his formulas close. Our legal team had drafted an intellectual property agreement, but he hadn't signed. Whatever he was building died with him. I stood. You're very forthcoming. She stood as well. It's better to answer questions early than face subpoenas later. I offered my hand. She shook it, cool, firm, businesslike. As I turned to leave, she said one last thing. Mr. Goodwin, if someone did kill Julian, they weren't trying to steal a scent. They were trying to silence a secret. Back outside, I breathed in the city's less delicate aroma, cabbage steam and diesel, and chewed over her last line. Not stealing, silencing. Maybe Wolfe had been right. The scent wasn't the weapon. It was the cover. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was in his chair with a book on medieval poisons and a look of mild indigestion. Fritz's veal ragout had failed to distract him, which meant he was deep in the weeds. Well, he asked as I dropped into my chair. Portia Moore says Julian was protective of his work. Claims she only wore the scent once. Says Phoebe was cold, Cale was nervous, and someone tried to bribe an assistant. But here's the part that stuck. She thinks Julian was silenced, not robbed. Wolfe tapped his fingers together. She may be right. Consider, Archie. What if the formula he developed wasn't merely dangerous, but incriminating? As in proof of a bigger game. Wolfe's eyes gleamed. Precisely. Something someone would kill to keep buried. And now 3 people are connected to the scent, I said. Delancey, Moore, the sachet. Then the scent itself, Wolfe said, isn't just a clue, it's the crime scene. The room fell quiet. Outside, a siren wailed in the distance. Something told me the next layer of this mystery wasn't going to smell like roses. Chapter 6. The Envelope That Wasn't Mailed. The next morning started with a phone call from Inspector Kramer, which is about as pleasant as a root canal performed by a gorilla. I had just poured my first cup of coffee when the phone rang. I picked it up, braced for bark. Goodwin, I said. "This is Kramer. I hear you and Wolfe are sniffing around Julian Richter's death." I could hear the cigar in his voice, probably clenched between his teeth while he paced the floor at Homicide West. "We're consulting," I said, "unofficially." "Have you ever heard of sticking to things that are official?" "Sure. Right before I heard Julian Richter's, lab didn't contain any suicide note, any flammable source, or any explanation for a gas leak that doesn't make a lick of sense." A long pause. "Meet me at Homicide in an hour," he said. "There's something you ought to see." When Kramer says oughta, you don't wait for a second invitation. I got dressed, made sure Wolfe had his coffee tray, and headed downtown. The squad room was its usual symphony of ringing phones, typewriter clacks, and detectives arguing over whether a suspect looked shifty or just tired. Kramer's office looked like he'd cleaned it with a snow shovel. He motioned me in, then dropped a sealed plastic bag onto his desk. Inside was a standard envelope, unmailed, yellowed around the edges. "Found this yesterday in Richter's apartment," he said. "Tucked behind a drawer panel in his desk. Didn't show up on the first sweep." "Another drawer panel," I said. "That desk must be more layered than a croissant." Kramer grunted. "It's addressed to a lawyer, guy named Seymour Varnett, Richter's old friend from Columbia. Envelope wasn't sealed. Read the letter." He handed me a photocopy. I read it aloud. "Seymour, if anything happens to me, I need you to go public with what I've left you. The formula I've been working on isn't just theoretical. It's been used, and not by me. Someone has already tested it. I believe Portia suspects something, but Phoebe doesn't know. Keep her out of this if you can. If you get this, it means I didn't make it. Julian." I set the page down slowly. So he was scared. "More than that," Kramer said. "He'd already passed something to this lawyer." "Where is it?" "Varnett's out of the country. Vienna. We've sent word, but it'll take time." I rubbed my jaw. "Are you planning on reopening the case?" "We're close. We just need one thing to push it over." "I might have something," I said, and told him about the sachet, the visit to the cloven hoof, and the perfume trail that ran from Moore to Delancey and back again. I left out Wolfe's theories. Kramer and Wolfe go together like mustard and ice cream. Kramer listened, scowling, deeper with each point. When I finished, he tapped the envelope with a thick finger. "This changes things. If what Wolfe's sniffing around is true, this wasn't about research. It was about something Richter caught wind of. Literally." I nodded. "And whoever used that formula probably didn't expect Richter to survive long enough to write anything down." "Keep me posted," he said. "And tell that orchid-growing dictator you work for that if he's got something solid, now's the time." I left the station house and headed back uptown, mind racing. By the time I hit the brownstone, Wolfe was already seated with a book of 18th century pharmacology open on his lap, and a look of mild disapproval on his face. "You're late," he said. "I was talking to Kramer. He found a letter Julian wrote to a lawyer friend. It confirms he was being watched, and that he passed something along." Wolfe looked up. "Indeed. It also mentions Portia suspected something, but wanted Phoebe kept in the dark." Wolfe closed his book with a soft thump. "Then the distinction is clear. Miss Delancey was either the pawn or the key." I handed him the photocopy. He read it in silence, his lips tightening slightly. "Wolfe," I said. "Cale said someone tried to bribe his assistant. Moore claims Richter was pressured to sign over his formula. But now it seems like he uncovered the formula had already been used." Wolfe nodded. "And if that is true, then we are not merely dealing with theoretical danger, but a murder that masked another crime. One of application." I blinked. "You think someone already used the formula to kill?" "I think," he said, standing slowly, "that someone weaponized a perfume before Richter ever completed the prototype. And Richter, with his meticulous nature, noticed the scent and traced its origins. That made him a liability. And now?" I asked. "Now," Wolfe said, walking toward the desk, "we must identify the test subject." I raised an eyebrow. "You want me to find another victim?" He turned. "No, you must find the first, before Julian." And just like that, the stakes doubled. Somewhere in this city, someone had already died quietly, scentlessly, and long before Julian Richter. And Wolfe, curse his immovable genius, was about to unearth a murder nobody even knew had happened. Chapter 7. The Woman Who Didn't Wake Up. If there's one thing I've learned about Nero Wolfe, it's this. When he tells you to find a corpse no one's looking for, he doesn't mean someday. He means yesterday, preferably with a signed affidavit and supporting documentation. We started with the obvious. I compiled a list of sudden, unexplained deaths in the past 6 months. Female victims, Midtown, no signs of trauma, no known illnesses. Wolfe had called Saul Panzer for help. And if Saul couldn't dig through a haystack blindfolded and come back with the needle and a backstory, nobody could. By noon, we had 5 candidates. By 3, we were down to 1. Her name was Lillian Aspinall. Age 38. Assistant art director at a boutique magazine. Found dead in her West 44th Street apartment 6 weeks ago. No signs of violence, no toxins found in the preliminary autopsy. Cause of death, cardiac arrhythmia, suspected idiopathic. Translation, we don't know, and we're not going to look harder. But there was one detail that caught Wolfe's eye. Lillian had attended a Delacroix and Moore fragrance, unveiling the night before she died. The same night it turned out that Portia Moore herself had worn a private sample created by Julian Richter. Wolfe closed the folder and gave me a look like I'd just offered him a beer with ice in it. "This is it," he said. "The proof." "Not quite proof," I said. "Not unless we can tie the scent to death." He tapped a thick finger against the folder. "She died in her sleep. No one suspected foul play because there was no visible wound. But Julian must have realized what happened. He created that formula to track the chemical signature, not to invent it. He was reverse engineering someone else's poison," I said slowly. "Just so," Wolfe said, and when he got too close to identifying the compound, or perhaps its source, he was removed. I paced the office, the wheels in my head spinning. That means Portia Moore lied. She wasn't testing a theoretical perfume. She was already wearing something that had been used once, to deadly effect. Or, Wolfe said, she was the delivery system, unwitting perhaps, but effective. It was a grim idea. Deadly perfume worn without knowledge. A murder passed off as heart failure. "I want to talk to Lillian's roommate," I said. "If she had one. Maybe she noticed something the night Lillian came home." Wolfe nodded. Proceed. I found the roommate listed in the building directory. Margot Brandt, freelance illustrator, currently living in the same apartment, 1 floor down. The super let me in after I flashed credentials. Wolfe had printed for just such emergencies. Nothing official. Just persuasive enough to pass for a licensing bureau badge if you didn't look too hard. Margot answered the door in paint-smeared jeans and a sweatshirt that looked like it had survived the Great War. She had sharp eyes, hair up in a lazy bun, and a face that didn't flinch easily. Miss Brandt, I asked, I'm investigating the death of your former roommate, Lillian Aspinall. May I come in? She let me in without a word. Inside, the place was all bookshelves, teacups, and canvases propped against the walls. It smelled like varnish and jasmine. Idiotium. Already spoke to the cops, she said, dropping onto a stool. They said it was natural causes, that she had a heart condition no one knew about. I know, but we think there may have been something more. She looked at me, narrowed her eyes. Like what? Did Lillian say anything odd that night before she died? About how she felt? Anything unusual? She said she was dizzy, Margot said quietly. Light-headed, like the room was spinning. I figured she drank too much at that perfume party. Did she mention the scent? She nodded. She said everyone was wearing something strong, but she singled out one woman, said it smelled like flowers and sugar and something else, something sharp, said it made her nauseous. I leaned forward. Did she say who the woman was? She didn't know, just said she was tall, dressed in blue, and looked like she owned the room. Portia Moore. Did Lillian have any pre-existing health issues? None. She biked to work, did yoga, had a cleaner diet than I've ever seen. I don't believe she just dropped dead. I handed her my card. Someone used her as a test run. We think the scent was the vector. If you remember anything else, anything, you call me. She nodded slowly, eyes wide. You really think it was murder? I think someone perfected a way to kill without touching, I said, and now we're trying to stop them from doing it again. Back at the brownstone, I gave Wolfe the update. He listened without comment, but the twitch at the corner of his mouth told me the engine was running hot. So, I finished, we have a prior victim, an untraceable scent, and a sample that might still be in circulation. Yes, Wolfe said, but no concrete proof that Miss Moore knowingly participated in the murder, unless we can prove she knew what the scent did. Wolfe nodded slowly. Then we must make her show us. Bring her here, Archie, politely but firmly. Any bait? He leaned back. Tell her Julian's lawyer is returning from Vienna, and he's bringing something that will end all speculation. That was a bluff, and Wolfe played it like a violin. I picked up the phone and dialed the number for Delacroix and Moore. Portia Moore answered herself. Mr. Goodwin, she said, I assume this is about Julian. Among other things, I said, Wolfe would like a word. Today. She hesitated. Why now? Because Julian's lawyer is back, and he's bringing the formula. Wolfe wants your version first. There was silence. Then, I'll be there at 6. I hung up and looked at Wolfe. She bit. He nodded once, eyes still locked on the folder in his lap. Then tonight, he said, we unmask a killer by her own scent trail. Chapter 8. The confrontation in the brownstone. At precisely 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I was already in the front hall, waiting. Fritz was off somewhere, pretending not to eavesdrop, and Wolfe was rooted in his chair in the office, arms folded, mouth a straight line of judgment. Everything was in place. I opened the door to find Portia Moore standing under the stoop light, like she was walking into her own final act. Still flawless. Navy silk coat, gloves like polished ink, and that perfume clinging to her like a soft-spoken shadow. Heliotrope, lilac, and a sharp trace of something that didn't belong in a bottle. Not for the living, anyway. Miss Moore, I said, ushering her in. This way. She walked with the grace of someone used to commanding boardrooms and ruining lives without raising her voice. As she entered the office, Wolfe didn't rise naturally. He simply observed her as one might a rare orchid that had suddenly developed teeth. She took a seat without being asked, legs crossed, gloves in her lap. "You said Julian's lawyer returned from Vienna?" she asked, not quite looking at either of us. "I did," I replied, "and I wasn't entirely honest. He's en route, but not quite in reach. We thought we'd give you a chance to speak freely first." Her mouth twitched, half a smile, half a snarl. "You lured me here on a bluff." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "No, Miss Moore. Mr. Goodwin used strategy. You are here because you're on the precipice of exposure, and your best defense at this point is clarity." She glanced between us, calculating. "I've already told you, Julian's death was tragic. I had nothing to do with it." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Let us examine that. You wore a scent developed by Julian Richter to an event where a woman, Lillian Aspinall, died unexpectedly the following day. A scent Julian later identified as chemically suspect. After that death, he began working in secret. He created a compound to mimic the scent's profile. He wasn't inventing a perfume, Miss Moore. He was investigating one." She opened her mouth, but he kept going. "You pressured him to sign over his formula. That pressure, whether financial or personal, is documented in correspondence we've seen. And when he refused, he died in a gas leak that was curiously convenient, with no proof of foul play, no visible wound, and no traceable poison." Her eyes narrowed. "That's all. Circumstantial." "Perhaps," Wolfe said, "but the scent is not." He nodded toward me. I retrieved the sachet from the evidence envelope and handed it to her. "This," Wolfe said, "was found in Julian's lab. It matches the scent found in your office, your sample bottle and your coat. And most importantly, it matches the compound Julian warned his lawyer about. She took it. Hold it. Smell it." "I didn't kill him," she said. "I didn't kill Lillian. I didn't kill anyone." "No," Wolfe said, his voice dropping an octave. "You didn't. But you wore the scent. You distributed it. And you knew, at some point, that it was dangerous. You saw Lillian die. You were present when Julian started pulling back. And you silenced him, not with poison, but with pressure. You didn't strike the match, but you left the gas running." She was quiet for a long moment. The sachet trembled slightly in her fingers. "Suspected," she said finally, "after Lillian. Julian didn't tell me everything, but I could see it in his eyes. He was scared. I assumed he'd tampered with something. I thought maybe I'd helped cause something I couldn't take back." Wolfe gave a small nod. "And so you wanted the formula, so no one else could ever know." "I didn't think he'd actually—" She stopped. He was brilliant, but paranoid. I never thought it would end like that. No one ever does, Wolfe said. But you withheld the truth, and you played a role. Her shoulders slumped, the illusion cracking. She looked older in that moment, the high society sheen dulled by something far more human. Guilt. What now? She asked. I spoke. Now we give Kramer the scent, the letter, and your statement. You'll paint me as a killer. We'll paint you as a catalyst, I said. Julian was murdered by fear and pressure. The poison was just the delivery method. She didn't argue. I escorted her out. She walked slower this time. No drama, no perfume. Back inside, Wolfe was already turning toward his orchids. The case was, for all intents and purposes, closed. You're not going to wait for Kramer? I asked. He will bellow, he will sputter, and he will confirm everything. I am not needed for that. I poured myself a drink and settled into my chair. You think more'll be charged? She may be, Wolfe said, but guilt has already marked her. He reached for a book and opened it, his voice fading into casual disinterest. And guilt, Archie, unlike perfume, never dissipates. Chapter 9. The report from Vienna. By the time the morning paper hit the stoop, the phone was already ringing. It was 9:15, which in Wolfe's world is the fragile buffer between breakfast and interruption. I answered before Fritz could grumble his way up from the kitchen. Goodwin, Archie, said a brisk, polite voice with a trace of European seasoning. This is Seymour Varnett, Julian's lawyer. I just arrived back from Vienna. The embassy relayed your messages. I assume you want to talk about the envelope. You assume right, Mr. Varnett. Wolfe would like to meet today. Name the time. 11, our brownstone. You'll be speaking to Wolfe, unless you'd prefer the police. There was a pause. I'll be there. I hung up and informed Wolfe, who offered no more than a grunt of acknowledgement and a precise bite of his croissant. By the time Varnett arrived, the scent of orchids had reclaimed the office. Fritz had vanished to the rear, and Wolfe had arranged himself like an immovable artifact of intellect and breakfast. Seymour Varnett was a lean, composed man in a grey wool coat and tortoise-shell glasses. He entered the room like someone who kept secrets for a living, which, technically, he did. Mr. Wolfe, he said, nodding. Mr. Goodwin. He sat across from Wolfe and set a leather folder in his lap. You have the letter Julian wrote. You, Wolfe said without preamble. Varnett nodded. And the packet he referenced. Wolfe's eyebrows rose. Did it survive? Yes. He handed it to me 2 days before his death. Told me to keep it sealed unless something happened to him. He slid the folder across the desk. I opened it carefully. Inside were 2 items. A typed manuscript. Formulae, compound breakdowns, chemical tests, and a small glass vial, identical in size and shape to the one Phoebe Delancey had brought us, but labelled in Julian's own blocky scrawl. Control test. Danger. Wolfe peered at it without touching it. Describe what he told. You, Varnett exhaled. Julian believed someone had developed a scent-based delivery system for a slow-reacting toxin, one that could be absorbed dermally or inhaled and metabolized in trace doses. Undetectable in standard testing. The fatal dose wouldn't present symptoms for hours, sometimes days, and would leave only minor biological anomalies. He was trying to identify the key compound before it was released commercially or used again. And he believed it had already been used, I asked. Yes, he referenced a woman, didn't give a name, who died after a Delacroix event. He was convinced it wasn't a coincidence. Lillian Aspinall, I said. Varnett nodded slowly. He said he suspected someone inside Delacroix, and Moore had either engineered it or unknowingly distributed it. But he didn't know who. That's why he kept working in secret. Wolfe leaned back. Miss Moore admitted to wearing the early sample, said she didn't know the effect, but she suppressed Richter's work and pressured him for the rights. She may not have intended to kill, but she silenced him. Varnett's expression didn't change, but his hand tightened on the arm of the chair. He warned me, he said, told me to be careful, told me that if anything happened, the formula couldn't be destroyed, that it had to be traced. Wolfe tapped the folder. And now it has been. I stood and moved toward the safe, unlocking it with Wolfe's instructions and placing the vial and manuscript inside. Wolfe didn't trust the police to handle delicate materials, not when they could barely handle delicate egos. Varnett watched, with silent approval. What happens now? Wolfe gave him a long look. Now you give a copy of the letter to Inspector Kramer. You tell him exactly what you told us. Let the law determine how far Miss Moore's negligence, or guilt, extends. She'll deny everything. Let her, Wolfe said. It will not matter. The scent tells its own story. Varnett stood. Thank you, gentlemen. Julian was a good man. Not easy, not always kind, but brilliant. I'm glad someone finally listened. After he left, Wolfe poured himself a beer, his one allowance before lunch, and sat quietly for a while, the bottle sweating on the desk. That woman, he muttered. Moore? Yes, her greatest crime was thinking she was clever enough to walk between raindrops. And Julian? I asked. Wolfe didn't answer right away. He finally looked at me, his expression unreadable. He saw too much, and too late. But he left a trail, enough for others to follow. That, Archie, is the mark of a man who tried, even if he lost. Especially if he lost, Wolfe said. There's no nobility in victory, only in resistance. He turned his chair toward the window, the orchids bathed in pale winter light. I left him to it, closing the office door behind me. One thing was certain. Julian Richter might have died with his secrets, but he didn't die quietly. Chapter 10. The final scent in the room. Inspector Kramer arrived the next morning wearing a wool coat that looked like it had been through a garbage disposal, and an expression that said, "Don't waste my time, unless someone's bleeding." I met him at the door and escorted him into the office, where Wolfe had already arranged the seating for maximum dramatic payoff. Kramer in the red chair, Wolfe behind the desk, me to the side with the file folder under my arm. "You've been busy," Kramer said, tossing his hat onto the nearest table. I got a call from Varnett. He handed over the letter and the sample. "He was instructed to," Wolfe said, steepling his fingers. "You now have the weapon, the motive, and the context. What you lack is conviction." Kramer snorted. "You don't prosecute the context, and the weapon's a perfume bottle. That's a hell of a story to take to a jury." "Then let us complete it." Wolfe said. He nodded to me. I placed the folder on Wolfe's desk and opened it. We tracked a death, I said, prior to Julian Richter's. A woman named Lillian Aspinall died in her sleep a day after attending a Delacroix and Moore gala. No pre-existing condition, no toxicology flags. But she described to her roommate a scent she couldn't shake. Floral, but with a sharp undertone. The same scent Miss Moore wore that night. The same scent Richter later tried to replicate and analyze. I pulled out the autopsy report we'd had Saul dig up and handed it to Kramer. He skimmed it, frowning. She was cremated, he muttered. Convenient, isn't it? I said. But her death started Richter on a trail. He began reconstructing the chemical properties of the scent, one he didn't create but recognized. That work got him killed. Wolfe tapped the desk. Julian Richter did not invent the poison. He discovered it, and he feared it had already been used. He attempted to trace it back to its source. Portia Moore, whether by negligence or intention, wore it, distributed it, and then sought to suppress it. Kramer grunted. You want me to charge her with what? Reckless homicide, suppression of evidence? Charge her, Wolfe said, with depraved indifference. She knew it was dangerous. She knew Lillian had died, and she tried to bury the formula rather than alert the authorities. She didn't pour the poison, Kramer growled. No, Wolfe replied. She simply let it travel. The silence in the room was thick enough to slice. Then Kramer stood, pocketed the report, and gave Wolfe a look I'd seen before, equal parts resentment and reluctant respect. I'll talk to the DA, he said, but don't expect a medal. Wolfe nodded, already reaching for the beer Fritz had set out. I never do. Kramer left without another word. The front door clicked shut behind him like a period at the end of a long, bitter sentence. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat. So that's it? I asked. No trial, no press, just another quiet case. Wolfe raised his glass. It was always a quiet case. That is what made it lethal. We sat there in the fading winter light, the orchids humming their invisible scent across the room. It had been a strange one, from the missing gas leak to the perfume that killed without warning, from a fiancé with grief-shaped armor to a partner who only realized the cost of silence too late. And somewhere across town, Portia Moore was, likely sitting in her glass tower, staring out over the city with the weight of untraceable guilt on her skin. No handcuffs, not yet. But Wolfe was right. Some crimes don't need a courtroom to convict. As for Phoebe Delancey, she sent a brief letter the next day, no return address, just a note that read, "Thank you for believing me, for seeing through the fog." PDI showed it to Wolfe. He sniffed once and said nothing, which for him was practically applause. We returned to routine the next morning. Orchids at 9, beer at 11, silence in between. But every so often, when I opened the office window and the breeze shifted just right, I swore I could still catch it, that final scent in the room. Faint, sweet, deadly. Chapter 11. The Orchid and the Ashes. A week passed. Kramer never called, which meant the DA was probably deciding whether Portia Moore would make for a politically complicated headline or a conveniently hushed warning. Wolfe didn't press. He'd done his part, and justice, whatever limp shape it took, was out of his hands now. That's what he said, anyway. but I noticed he spent more time than usual with his orchids, trimming them with a kind of precision that had less to do with petals and more with frustration. On the 7th day, the mail brought a surprise. Fritz handed me a heavy envelope with a red wax seal and expensive paper stock. The kind that says I don't write often, but when I do, someone's already dead. I opened it at the desk while Wolfe sipped his beer and ignored me. The note inside was short. To Mr. Wolfe and Mr. Goodwin, thank you for protecting what little truth remained of Julian. You were right. The poison wasn't just in the vial. Please accept this gift not as penance, but as acknowledgement. The world is quieter for his absence. P. Moore. Alongside it was a smaller package. Inside, a single glass perfume bottle, unopened, labelled in delicate gold script, La dernière note, the last note. Wolfe looked at it like it might explode. "Fritz!" he barked. "Bring gloves! And the lead box!" I smirked. "Don't you want to give it a sniff?" "Pfui," he muttered. "This is not a souvenir. It is evidence." "Not any more," I said. "Moore knows she won't be charged. This is her way of ending the story, by tying it with a bow and handing us the scent that started it all." Wolfe glowered at the bottle. "It is either arrogance or absolution. I do not care either. Still, he didn't throw it out." We sealed the bottle, documented it, and slid it into the safe next to Julian's original notes and the control vial, just in case Kramer changed his mind, or in case someone else tried to use the formula again. That night, I went for a walk. Sometimes, after a case like this, quiet, personal, without the fanfare or the headlines, I needed to breathe somewhere other than that house of logic and orchids. I found myself near the Cloven Hoof, the same bar where Julian had sat watching shadows. It was louder now. The neon buzzed with drunken energy, and the jukebox had decided tonight was for jazz that sounded like a nervous breakdown. I didn't go in, just stood across the street, hands in my coat pockets, wondering how many people pass each other every day without knowing they're carrying something lethal. The truth is, most murders aren't loud. They don't come with screams or sirens. They come with silence, a whisper, a bottle of perfume, a letter that isn't mailed. Wolfe once said that guilt is like a scent. It lingers. He was right. Back at the brownstone, the office was quiet again. Fritz had retired for the night. Wolfe had retreated to his room with a book that weighed as much as a watermelon. I sat alone, thinking of Phoebe Delancey, of Lillian Aspinall, of the letter Julian never sent until it was too late, and of Portia, Moore, untouched, untried, but not, I suspect, unpunished, because in the end, the most lasting scent isn't the one worn on skin, it's the one left behind. Chapter 12. The Silence That Solved Everything. 2 weeks after Portia Moore's parting gift arrived, the case of Julian Richter's death was officially closed, filed away in the kind of folder that collects dust in a cabinet no one dares open. The police couldn't pin a charge, the DA wouldn't commit to a trial, and Portia Moore remained as free and composed as she'd ever been. But the press had sniffed out enough smoke to fan speculation. A few industry rags ran cautious, stories about olfactory ethics and untraceable risks in boutique compounds. Nothing stuck, but the shadow lingered. Wolfe, true to form, didn't follow up. Once the logic had run its course and the scent trail had cooled, he was done. He returned to his orchids with renewed discipline, as if their unchanging needs could wash the world clean. Me, I kept one eye open. Cases like this don't really end. They just stop being written about. But late one evening, something arrived that neither of us expected. It was a manila envelope, hand-delivered and unsigned. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded twice. Typed, Julian knew. He wasn't wrong. I wore the scent that night, not out of carelessness, but instruction. He was meant to observe, not interfere. He broke protocol. That's why it happened. I didn't know Lillian would die, but once she did, I understood the message. I burned the original formula. This is not a confession. This is the end. I handed it to Wolfe in silence. He read it, then read it again. Then he placed it flat on his desk, his fingertips resting lightly on the corners, like a man trying to sense a pulse that had long since stopped beating. She was the courier, he said at last, not the designer. Someone else created the scent, or wore it to deliver it. To test it, I added, without knowing the stakes. Perhaps not at first, Wolfe said, but she knew after. She understood the consequence, and still she chose silence. He pushed back from the desk and stood, the way a tree might if it could be annoyed. She did not kill Richter, he said, not directly, but she sentenced him the moment she withheld the truth. I nodded slowly. And now she's trying to end the story. She cannot, Wolfe said, heading for the kitchen. Stories do not end when people stop speaking. They end when people stop listening. That was his version of closure. I placed the letter in the safe, beside the control vial, and the rest of the evidence we'd accumulated. It wasn't for the police anymore. It was for the record, Wolfe's record. A few nights later, I sat in the office alone. Rain tapped the windows, and the city below hummed in that way only New York can, like a tired boxer still standing after the bell. I found myself thinking about Julian Richter, about Lillian, about the invisible murders no one sees coming. There was no great reveal. No dramatic unmasking in front of a crowd. Just pieces, a whisper, a scent, a silence. But Wolfe had solved it. He'd seen past the smoke, past the formula, to the truth behind it. That's his genius. He doesn't need drama, just logic. I poured myself a drink and leaned back in my chair. Wolfe had already retired for the night, and the orchids rustled faintly in their room as the air shifted. Somewhere, Portia Moore was probably standing at a window just like this, watching the same rain fall, her scent replaced by something neutral, something safe. But I'd remember, because sometimes the most dangerous crimes don't leave bruises, they leave echoes, and Wolfe, damn him, always hears them first.